we put like a request for the light or something? Like, cause like I like the lights, but
Yeah.
that's the one.
And see at what level that stuff's put.
Why is this one still back?
Gosh.
Right at the start of the show.
The camera's not.
He's leading the discussion today.
Oh, God. Head start. But there was.
How's everybody doing?
Yeah, there was. But that was a different- Okay.
Huh? Sleep deprived?
Yeah, he does.
We're doing okay.
Wait, really? Is it?
Is anyone doing the Target on 10 Miler this weekend?
Oh.
No, I will not be participating.
I'm not.
Unfortunately, I will not be participating with 10 miles.
I just feel like 10 miles is too short for me.
Oh, yeah.
Right, right.
Oh, yeah.
It's been-
It's Iron and a bus.
Same.
Yeah. I haven't run in 8
I
months.
thought you said you were training.
Yeah, I was, and then life happened. I haven't been doing that.
How long do you run like per day? How many minutes?
Well,
Well, like how many did you before you stopped? Is it a lot?
I mean,
Like more than 5
years
minutes?
ago it was.
Are you sure you don't want to just put on like Tiger Woods in the Masters for this class? We can watch it.
He's playing right now.
Yeah.
It's on hole like 8.
12 under par.
Even.
Of course he is.
I missed a lot of way to walk over here. so-
Yeah.
What is the score?
I think he's even. The amateur from UNC is +1.
Nice.
Not bad. I played him in my fantasy Masters.
Yeah, my FanDuel Masters.
Caitlin's in the weight room.
All right. Well, happy Thursday to you. Happy Masters.
Should I throw some money on Tiger?
No.
It's a
Yeah.
bad bet.
What if it's to make the cut?
I bet on him making the cut. Yeah, he's making the cut, baby.
I don't know. So today, I mean, we've only got 4 classes left. 5 classes left.
Wow.
Something like that.
You must be honest.
All right, we have today, and then we've got 2 weeks. 1, 2, 3, maybe 1 more.
Pizza parties.
Yeah, 4.
What's going this one?
For us, it's 26.
We have
Thursday off next week, right?
Yeah, it's real.
Oh,
Yeah.
Anyhow, so the plan, moving forward is, one, remember you've got a problem set that's due.
Tonight.
Is it tonight? Did I set it for tonight?
Yeah.
Can we push that back? If you want to do it, I'm not gonna look at it until at least the weekend.
Oh.
And hopefully my whole weekend will be spent dealing with my mom. We'll see. My wife is actually getting ready to take her to the doctor, so should be an intriguing.
And is this like do they have a good mother-in-law relationship or?
Fine. It's just that my mom is a very difficult person to be with.
Doesn't help the dinners and having to talk to her.
Well, and she's just a difficult person to be with, but she's having a lot of mental confusion.
Yeah.
That came on very suddenly. And so trying to figure that out, but she called me before I got here. Actually, the front desk of where she lives called me. And she was all upset because she couldn't get in touch with anybody and she thought her doctor's appointment was at 10. Even though my brother told her this morning on the phone that it was at 3:30. But then she couldn't get her phone to work at all. And anyway, it's all sad and annoying at the same time. Anywho, so today we're going to do just talk about this Head Start evaluation. Really practicing applying the stuff from the program eval. I did post the recorded lecture for those of you, just most of you who weren't here on Tuesday. It's under lessons. And then next week, we'll do cost benefit analysis. And then I guess next Thursday, we don't have class. Is that right?
Yeah.
So we'll do the first cost benefit analysis. We'll come back and do the second cost benefit analysis, policy diffusion. And then do one more after that, yeah. And then we'll sort of do a wrap up. I can't remember, I think your exam is on the 3rd, is that right? And so what I'm gonna do, the other classes exam is on the 5th. I'm gonna try to find a way for one of the reading days, I'm gonna find a big room to hold a review session. We can do some of it the last day of class, but I figured we won't have studied to that point. And doing a review session, we haven't even looked at anything, isn't super helpful. The exam is going to look a little bit different. It's going to have multiple choice, true, false, and short answers. I was feeling guilty about that until I really remembered that I put a bunch of true, false, and multiple choice and stuff on the problem sets. So you know sort of the way that I write those questions. And I will not weight them as heavily as I do the short answers. But yeah, but it'll be in class. Yeah. Second paper draft is due some point next week. And then we'll do the same procedure where if you want to meet with me and talk about comments, we can do that. If you haven't gotten comments back on your first draft, send me an email to remind me. I've been reading them as I have meetings with people. And then sometimes I forget when people don't sign up for meetings. That's about it. Yeah. So let's talk about this evaluation that was done a while ago, but I still find it to be a very, very useful example of how evaluations are typically done, because it presents some issues, shows some ways that I try to get around the issues. There's good parts, there's bad parts, all kinds of fun stuff, right? So let's just start with some basic stuff. Okay, what are the questions that they're trying to answer in this eval? Sure.
What's the impact of Head Start on like children's readiness for school, and then like parenting tactics and like
Yeah, so it's important to understand that the first question, there's sort of two parts to it, and that they're looking at educational outcomes, but they're also looking at home, specifically parenting outcomes, which is interesting, because I'm not sure that the program was necessarily designed to teach parents not to be authoritarian, right? Which seems to be what it is that they want to look for. And then what was the second one?
like what educational methods can Head Start work for certain children and what don't.
Yeah, kind of what works when. just a very general question, did they answer all his questions? No, why not?
Like in the summary section at the very end, it was kind of ambiguous. They were like, oh, we have this data and it seems like for some groups it's effective, but the kid's been followed up to 3rd grade and the data that we have now might be useful for whoever is going to look at it in the future and see if there's an actual impact having.
Yeah, so there's the longer term impacts, right? But that's not what they were necessarily tasked with answering. But did they answer that second one? What works when?
Didn't they just say like it would work a lot more for the younger kids, but then they didn't like answer the questions of why it didn't work in 1st grade or on, like they didn't look at the other
They did not
factors.
get too much of the why. Did anybody catch why they didn't get to that? Or what some potential flaw with the design was that would make them not be able to? If not, it's okay, we'll come back to it. Yeah.
Wasn't like in the control group, the kids had like a lot more readiness in terms of like preschool and non-parental teaching.
Well, there's some indication, right? Like, we're not some indication, there was data that showed that they were getting more hours of non-parental care. That's something that might have messed things up. It really has to do with what their sort of primary dependent variable was on these things. We'll get back to that in a little bit, but you can just sort of ponder what that was. So how did they set up the design? Somebody knows. Right?
Was it a division of like 2 separate groups? One was control, one was Head Start. The control group had 4-year-olds who were less dependent parents. And that control group go through first and kindergarten, 1st grade, while the 3-year-olds who were in the Head Start program were in whatever section of it. It wasn't kindergarten, 1st grade goes.
All right, so first they divided them into 2 subsections, like right from the get-go. So they were looking at kids who were starting as 3-year-olds, and then they were looking at kids who were starting as 4-year-olds. Yeah. How do they select the kids? How do they select the centers? Yeah.
So the centers had to apply for the program with certain, they picked programs across the country, and then the parents had to apply to the Head Start. And then they were told that the incoming process would be different, even though the Head Start still followed its normal selection process.
Yeah, so in terms of the kids getting into a treatment versus control group, it was in fact random. Which was put a big limitation on which centers could actually be studied, right? Because they had to have enough kids, enough spots at that center to allow for random assignment. But you also may have noticed that there were more kids in the treatment group than in the control group. And part of that is because they wanted to include some centers, I think, where there wasn't enough to do a 50-50 split. So you get random assignment of kids. Let's go back to the beginning. How do they pick the centers at which, besides just the sheer numbers? Like, that was one big limiting factor. They had to have the right number, but what else did they do? They try to randomly pick the centers, right? It's almost a double random type deal where they got, you have this sort of pool of eligible centers, right, in here, and they randomly selected the centers. Okay. The centers, and I know this is going to sound very picky, but this kind of stuff is important when you're reading this stuff. There were centers in 23 states. Okay, that's important because that means there were not centers in 27 states. And we know how varied the US is. Right, they didn't really give us a whole lot of breakdown on rural versus urban, although they did talk about specific impacts on rural kids. That would have been something that would have been useful, and honestly, if you look at the full report, you can find some of this stuff. This is just the executive summary. But you know, it's what's known as a stratified random sampling. You don't necessarily need to know that term, but they do random sampling at multiple levels. All right, so we've got these two things. Yep. Both of them sort of operate the same. What happens to the kids who aren't put into Head Start?
They're still given the option to do whatever they want, so they can still join into other care programs, or even they said eventually some of them made it into Head Start.
Yeah, right. So they're still given the option to go to another daycare, or even though they said at one point that they were going to preclude them from Head Start, there was a sizable chunk of them. It was like 17% of the 3-year-olds and like 14% of the 4-year-olds that still ended up in Head Start. So what's the comparison? What's the comparison going on? It's Head Start to what? Yeah, it's just Head Start to everything else. Yeah, and that's actually important because that's the question that they're asking, right? How well does Head Start work? Is it better than other stuff that's available? You know, but yeah, what do you think they had to do with those kids who ended up in Head Start?
Control for them and like.
Yeah, that's when the fancy statistics comes in, and when you read the full report, they talk about these crossovers and other things like that. They don't get into it in the executive summary that much. The other thing is, not all the kids who were assigned to Head Start actually went to Head Start. So why do you think these are obvious limitations on the study. Why do these exist? I mean, it's not like the evaluators weren't aware that these are limitations.
I just think wouldn't be really morally right to say your kid can't have education.
Yeah, there's an ethical issue here, right? And we talked about ethical issues being problematic when it comes to policy research, especially when it comes to doing experiments, which is what they're trying to sort of do, right? At least by randomly assigning, they're trying to approach the experimental method. But there's going to be some limitations based on the real world nature of this, and them not wanting to preclude children from getting decent early education. So that's something we talked about in class that you see immediately, that you're like, why are you doing that? And they're like, oh yeah. Anybody notice anything else about how kids were selected or any other issues with the sort of 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds?
The demographic groups are different, like the breakdown of race is very different between like the 3-year-olds and the 4-year-olds or something.
Yeah, and that was one of the reasons why they separated them out, right? When they looked at the descriptive statistics sort of at the beginning, they noticed a fairly large difference. And it mostly had to do with the number of Hispanic kids, where 50-some%, I think it was like 56% or something, of the newly entering 4-year-olds were Hispanic.
Wasn't there also something to do with a language barrier within the 4-year-old group, like the Hispanic children were growing up like speaking Spanish and then had to transition to English as well?
It's part of why they probably wanted to do them differently, is the underlying differences within that population. But yeah.
I was a little confused, like in the first part of the key findings, when they say Head Start experiences, And it talks about how providing access to Head Start increases the likelihood that low-income children will be enrolled in a center-based early childhood program, including center-based Head Start, preschool and childcare. So are they trying to say that like providing access to Head Start increases the likelihood that they'll be in a center-based early child program, but they also just have access to Head Start because they're already like given access?
I mean, it's sort of a duh
Like,
statement,
that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
that by providing Head Start, we are in fact increasing opportunities for children to be in a center-based learning environment.
All right.
But they felt like the need to point that out,
Yeah.
you know, because a lot of the kids who weren't assigned a Head Start, right, a lot of them were in centers, but a lot of them were with parents or grandparents, you know, or something like that. And so by providing, you know, some of these people with somewhere to go, Head Start, they are increasing the overall number in a center. Having one of those days where every little thing that could go wrong goes wrong. One of those. This is a just very basic question. When did Head Start begin?
The original idea came up 65, then it got reauthorized 98, and then they cut now too.
Okay. Yeah, that's very specific. Good job. So the program started in the 60s. Okay, this particular evaluation though came out of the reauthorization in 98. What does that tell you about one of the cardinal evaluation rules?
Possible motivation for someone doing this study.
There's definitely motivation. I mean, if you just think about the politics as to why they're doing this, right? 1998, you're talking about sort of the end, or nearing the end of the Newt Gingrich time period when they were trying to reduce government spending on social programs sort of everywhere, right? So as part of the reauthorization, they're like, yeah, but you have to show us that actually works, because they weren't convinced.
30 years for it to.
Why would it take 30 years? Well, that's the thing. Were there evaluations before? We don't really know, but they don't reference any ones that were done previously, and you feel like they would have, even in an executive summary. And you know, the policy process model tells us that we should always be evaluating things to see if they work. And this was obviously a failure. But you know, one of the issues that they have in designing this is that, you know, they're doing it 35 years later, which means that the sort of data collection tools and that kind of stuff aren't really in place. And there's probably been some shift in program goals and that kind of stuff, like the authoritarian parenting. But it makes it a lot harder to evaluate a program when you're having to do it after it's been established for so long. So tell me this. I actually said something earlier about the dependent variable. What are they measuring? Are they, let me ask you this. Are they including all Head Start programs in the sample? I mean, all types of Head Start programs, or are there different types? I should really think through my questions before I ask.
I mean, there was a slight difference in between centers, like they all like, they had like a little bit of different curricula based on like what was really needed in that community specifically.
Okay,
there's a
so
little
there
bit
are
of
differences in the programs. There's some pretty significant differences. I don't know if you'll pick any of this up. So I'm just curious to see.
Didn't say there was like some I don't know, it's like 15% that didn't focus on like math or something like that versus like the rest that did.
So there's actually this rating system that they use to put a number on how good a Head Start program is, right? How much it is sort of following best practices and that kind of stuff. And there were a decent percentage of these that had a fairly low score. It was like 60% of them had a 5 or above, and that's out of 7. But like, that means 40% of them had less than a 5. So essentially, you're talking about good Head Start centers, mediocre Head Start centers, and bad Head Start centers. Why would they include all of them?
Want it to be generalizable to like elementary.
They wanted to be generalizable to the program itself. And this is a key word to look for when you're looking at various things and or a key phrase. The average treatment effect. So use of the word average tells you that they're including everybody, right? It also means that it's, you know, you're gonna have these outliers out there, and they may be skewing the results. If, for example, these lower quality Head Start programs had like negative impacts, and that's gonna wipe out some of the positive impacts from the good programs. This is what bugs me about the second research question. They want to know when it works and why and under what circumstances, but then they do average treatment effect. And you'll see this in a lot of studies. You know, it's kind of like when you go to the doctor and you say something's wrong and they just say, well, you're going to take this because it helps most people. It's called average treatment. Oh, I should like it. Anyway, but that is a huge part of understanding the evaluation and being able to interpret some of the findings. And what's key about it, the way that you should think about the framing is any impacts that they're finding are conservative estimates. You know? So what were some of the impacts? Well, let's just, oh, go ahead.
There were like some distinguishing factors that they, or like there's like cognitive and some other descriptors for the groups, but they said that I think like across the board, a lot of the, like for the third graders or the 3-year-olds especially, it was effective, but then like approaching like first grade, the effects kind of diminished between the control group and the treatment group.
Yeah. So, and that's actually true for both groups, it was especially true for 3-year-olds. At the end of that first year, there were statistically significant positive results on everything that they measured, which you would hope to be the case, right? They literally just finished that 1 year. And then what's interesting about it is as the years go on, and they only go to first grade in this evaluation, but as the years go on, the number of statistically significant variables just drops, right? So that by the end of first grade, there are very few that are remaining. And I can tell you there have been other evaluations for Head Start since this one that have followed kids through like 8th grade. And by 8th grade, there's just nothing left. Yeah. So, you know, why would we still be pushing Head Start? Let me get another Charlotte and then Kim.
Well, because first of all, there are significant differences for Also Head Start provides like dental insurance and stuff for some kids, so that would make a big difference in their life at that moment. So just because 10 years later, there's not a big difference, it does make a difference.
Yeah,
And like, it's also not addressing the fact that in school, other kids are gonna catch up, and we would hope there's not like a huge difference of like Head Start versus other kids in school.
yeah, we'll talk about the mission of catching up in a second.
I think the government pushed Head Start because it makes it look like they're doing something.
You think it's just a symbolic program,
Yeah,
despite the fact that it has demonstrated positive impacts
well, I
within
mean,
the first
it demonstrates,
couple of years.
it demonstrates positive impacts in the beginning, but then they're essentially like wiped away after like 2 years.
Okay,
Also, this like isn't taking into account, like, there's like a scope, like Head Start is not reaching all children in any capacity, so like, it may show positive impacts, but like, even if it was implemented in full, like.
It's like an official who like pushes it gets to say, yeah, like we did this to help underprivileged kids. Look at their numbers from 3rd and 4th grade. And someone's like, well, what about 2nd grade? And they're like, oh.
And also,
that's
we got, like the parents, like without the Head Start program, you said that like a lot of kids were like under supervision of their parent or grandparents, so like providing them access to that allows them.
there's some benefit there at the beginning. Let me get Michelle. She's very nice, she has her hand up.
I guess like there's a political reason behind it because
Yeah.
like parents, if the education of their children is on the line, there's more of a reason for them to vote, but also there was a section talking about the results in which it said that certain demographic subgroups also had favorable impacts. It didn't talk about if these impacts diminished over time, but these subgroups included children with parents who had depression, children who were dual language learners, children who were on lower cognitive skills, and African American children.
Yeah,
So it gives a chance.
and most of those were the 3-year-old group,
Oh,
just so you know. The 4-year-old group actually found a negative impact of kids who had parents with depression.
That was also the 3-year-old group too.
Yeah, well,
That had unfavorable impacts on 3-year-olds with these parents reported moderate
right.
depressive symptoms.
thanks for making depressed parents feel even better about themselves.
Wouldn't it cause burnout for like children who are now in an accelerated program, because children who've been used to getting like harder and harder questions, their brains aren't technically stimulated by like regular like education anymore, so it's actually more of a harmful program.
Well, I don't think you can say it's harmful. Even if they regress back towards the mean, it didn't hurt them. So they,
I think it's also like important to like note that they, like, just going back to what I said earlier, it's like when they were doing this assessment, the kids were only up to 3rd grade, and something that they noted in the results section was that one possible rationale for like why the data might have like converged and there was no difference between the treatment and the control group is because I think they theorized that maybe like the relationship between the parents and the children was better, and they think that like maybe it's like the diminishing comparison was because of that up until the 1st grade, but they weren't sure of the long-term impacts that would have on development and productivity in the future.
yeah. Well, I mean, tell me this, policy people. How do we maintain the positive benefits after that 1st year? So you talked about kids catching up. Talked about just politics and that kind of stuff, right? But like, what kind of schools are these people going to?
Mostly public, because they're all like mainly going to students.
Yeah, it's basically all public schools.
There's nothing wrong with public schools.
There's nothing wrong with public schools, but what kind of
Everyone
public
knows
schools?
that, how they urban, low income neighborhoods.
In red line districts.
Yes, right? The vast majority of these kids are in lower income, mostly minority school districts. Now, they try to say at one point that most of them are in middle level, like middle sort of quality schools. But then they go on to say all this stuff about low income, minority populations, and all this kind of stuff. And so, I think about it almost as like How many of you, did any of you learn another language as a kid? You still speak that language?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I learned English.
Did anybody learn a language that they no longer speak?
I'm pretty good at Spanish. I was basically fluent.
You were?
Yeah.
What happened?
I stopped speaking it when I came to college.
Yeah,
I was good at Arabic as a kid. When
Oh,
I
really?
stopped practicing it because I was becoming less.
yeah, I
fluent.
mean, my daughter did kindergarten and first grade in dual language Mandarin
Ooh, at
English
Glenwood?
at Glenwood.
Nice. James Taylor went there.
And she doesn't remember any Chinese. All three of my kids went to full Spanish immersion daycare, like up until kindergarten. And while I think it helps them in Spanish class, they don't really remember that because they didn't really ever speak it. Right? Well, what happens to skills that you gain and then you stop using?
I used to be a really good pianist.
So did I.
Yeah. No, I don't remember anything.
No,
I played
no,
for
I'm terrible.
4 years, yeah.
I played for 9.
Dang.
Ooh.
Yeah. So I mean, if you just think about the reality of the situation, right? They're in this, generally at least higher quality educational setting when they're 3, they're 4. They get into kindergarten, first grade, and then as they move up, it just gets sort of worse and worse, right? They're not using, what was provided to them. So like, from my perspective, an evaluation like this is more of an indictment of our public school system than it is the Head Start program. At least that's a way to frame it politically. Right? What this shows us is, we're spending all this money, we're getting these good results, and then we just let it all go away because we refuse to spend money on public education. Saw a hand somewhere.
Yeah, I was gonna say that.
Sorry, I didn't mean to steal your
No,
thunder.
no, no, you didn't.
If you were doing a problem definition of this, how would you, what would you say?
The positive effects of Head Start are not maintained. Not maintained over the long run. You could argue like, well, look, until we change the education system, then we shouldn't even bother. But there are these other things, like there are some evidence, at least they have dental insurance, health insurance. There is some lessening of authoritarian parenting and other sort of parenting faux pas. And, at least they're somewhere. From a parent's point of view, I look at things like this and it's terrible, but I just think about babysitting. You think about parents who are trying to work. They need somewhere to send their kid, and daycare is really freaking expensive. You go to a center in Chapel Hill, that's good. You're talking like $1,700 a month. Who can afford that? I guess like tenured professors and that kind of thing. That's why I actually bartered my legal services in exchange for daycare.
Spanish immersion daycare, no way.
Spanish immersion daycare. It's a great place. What else did you notice about the evaluations? What's something that stuck out to you? Michelle?
I wasn't sure if the study was double blind or not, but it said that the teachers said that the 4-year-olds in the program were less socially adept. And I was wondering, was that true, or did they just think that because they're in Head Start, they're smart kids and smart kids
They don't really give us any context for it, but no, it's not. These are not blind studies, right? And we talked about the importance of blind and double blind studies in science, but you can't do that. They know if they're in Head Start or not. And, you know, we know that the kids who aren't assigned a Head Start went and tried to find other programs.
Wasn't it only like 18 or something % that went and like found programs outside of Head Start though?
No, it was like 60 or 70%. Yeah. so-
I felt like, well, they talk about like, I think just like 3-year-old cohort had like better relationships like with their parents.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I feel like academics is like you can like quantify that, like measure that based off like tests. I don't know, I feel like you're like parents were like this, there's no like scale, like.
No,
scale.
but you know, even if parents just believe that they have a better relationship with their child because of this, maybe that's positive, right?
I guess to add on to the fact that they only selected Head Start programs that had a sufficient number of applicants. Because of that, they couldn't choose programs that were serving special populations such as those in Native American lands, those serving migrant and those serving seasonal farm workers. I just think that that's not very good on an equity point of view if you're leaving out groups that have statistically shown time and time again that they don't receive the funding that they need.
Well, that's part of the trade-off that you make, right? When you're doing these research designs of who you can include and who you can't include. And if there aren't a sufficient level in number of kids in those programs to allow this random assignment. And you know, one of the reasons that, you know, especially you think about like Native American lands and that kind of stuff, you know, there just may not be another center like on the reservation. So it's like Head Start or nothing. Well, you don't want to throw those in necessarily with this other group that's Head Start or centers, you know, or, you know, not nothing really. Sometimes there's nothing. But we used to call latchkey kids. They still use that term? Or any of you latchkey kids? Yeah.
Yeah.
Basically, it means that you went to school and you came home and you were by yourself until your parents got home from work.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, sometimes. My mom worked double jobs, so sometimes instead of going home, I'd sit in a Burger King table until she got up for a shift and then I'd go home.
You were kind of a latchkey kid or a Burger King kid.
Grew up there.
So my wife was that way. The time she was like 6 years old. What else? Anything that you were just like, what in the hell?
It was kind of interesting that for the 3-year-old group, after the first year, there was like a good bit, like 10% that just stopped going to Head Start.
Isn't that funny? Like, why would you stop? I mean, it could be, I mean, that's the thing, is they don't explain why. It could be that they moved, right? Like, didn't track them to wherever they went to, you know, before. But if they just like decided, no, I'd rather pay money to go to a private center. There are people like that, right? I'd rather pay a bajillion dollars and go to Duke in Carolina, just so that we can lose on all of the important basketball games. Only the important ones.
Not so fun there.
I mean, look, I went to private school, so I'm not making fun of anything. My parents looked at the public education system where we were living and we were like, oh, no.
Same.
So I grew up mostly, I started in Winston-Salem, but then growing up in Virginia. Anybody from Winston-Salem?
You first state of the country.
I did go to Forsyth Country, did you?
I'm from Winston.
Are you?
I went to West Forsyth, yeah.
Okay.
Why did you wait so long?
Well, I didn't register.
Yeah, I went to Forsyth Country Day for kindergarten.
Bring back some good memories.
You know, the extent of what I remember about kindergarten is like break time, like when they had snack. Because that was my favorite.
I feel like goldfish tasted a lot better back.
Well, see what I remember is this, is my parents used to send me with these little cans of White House apple juice. You know, have you seen those things?
No.
They're like 8 ounces,
That sounds kind of hard.
right? And I used to, like, for entertainment for the other kids, I used to chug mine. I don't know what that
Do you
is.
have
but-
problems now?
It sounds about that.
The problems. The problems.
I was like,
I don't know. But that's what I remember. It's just like what I remember from pre-K was I got in trouble for kissing a girl and I had to stand in the corner.
Wow. You're just like throwing back apple juice and like, and you trouble calling out girls in the middle of class.
You wear a leather jacket.
Well, that's crazy. No, that's not where
You
leather
definitely was chasing
jacket. That was a good thing.
His mom let me sit up in the front seat when he was a kid.
You run.
No, I sat, we had a Volkswagen Bug, one of those.
Punch like that question.
And, yeah, well, I'm the youngest kid, so that's part of the problem. Anybody else the youngest kid?
I'm the only.
Yeah, of course you are. Yeah, but, you know, the Volkswagen, there's not really room for 3 people in the back seat. But in the old Bugs, they had this cubby in the back. It was literally like a cubby. It was like, you know, this big. That's where I sat. We didn't have car seats, seatbelt laws.
That's seatbelt laws.
We didn't.
I know, but
I know your generation finds that so crazy to think of.
I just saw like a thing that was like, who was a libertarian? Guy who ran as libertarian, most
Ron
famous.
Paul?
Ron Swanson?
No, I don't even know. It's not Ron Swanson. Who was it? I don't even remember who it was.
Gary Johnson.
I don't know. Yeah, it was Gary Johnson. Yeah, Gary Johnson. They're like Gary Johnson got made fun of for saying driver's licenses are okay or something like that.
Yes, I know exactly.
I love that clip.
What?
And then there's like the guy who says, what's next? You're gonna make us have licenses to like use a poster?
Yeah.
There's one Gary Johnson. He's on.
Let's kind of rein it in a little bit.
Yeah, that clip is so funny.
Is there anything else about this that you found useful, helpful, not helpful?
I found it disturbing.
Oh, okay.
How did they
Not
measure
bad.
whether or not the child, like a parent spanked a child last week? Like, I'm just like.
So this is actually something to think about as we go into cost benefit analysis and we start thinking about more specifically how we measure things.
Yeah.
How do you measure that?
Were they asking kids?
They certainly weren't asking kids, they were asking parents.
If you ask a parent, what if they don't want it says?
Like,
Yeah. Is there like a-
So this is one of the problems with surveys in general, right? Is that there's a possibility that people can be lying. Right? It's like these surveys of teen drug use. I find those to be hysterical.
Euphoria got it right.
Euphoria got it right. I don't let myself watch Euphoria because I think it'll just make me super depressed.
Yeah. I will.
Yeah.
Don't watch it.
It was an awful show.
I feel like.
Or it'll make me want to chug a whole bunch of
I
apples.
haven't seen it.
Yeah.
But-
Make sure there's a whole bunch of apple juice.
I won't be watching.
Anything else that you saw in there that?
A lot of the graphs are like empty, even when it says some of them weren't applicable for that year, they just didn't have any p value listed for anything.
When they actually were listing the.
Yeah, there's nothing for
significance.
like half of the.
No, because I mean, and if you read it's a terrible way to do a table.
Yeah, it just looks bad.
So this is a good lesson on how not to use a table in a thing. They only put the numbers where they were statistically significant. You should put all the numbers and then just show which ones are significant. But if they were white, it meant that they measured them, but they weren't statistically
just didn't think
significant.
that.
If they were gray, it meant that they were not applicable. But I agree, it's a terrible way to present data. Because something isn't statistically significant at whatever threshold they put in, doesn't mean it's not really close. It doesn't mean it doesn't have some other significance. Right, there is such a thing as non-statistical significance.
I feel like one good part of the study, even though there were a lot of things that were lacking, I feel that because they kind of had a staged model in which they had 4-year-olds and 3-year-olds, it gave a bit more nuance to the results. And
Yeah.
Yeah,
I mean, look, we've been sitting here, talking about all the limitations of the study. And that's one of the reasons why I had you read it. But what I really want you to take away is this is actually a really good study. They did as good of a job pretty much as they could have. Right? It still has meaning, even with all these limitations. You just have to be aware of the limitations, right? And you have to be transparent about them when you're writing. And they were to a certain extent, in here. But, it shows you how hard it is to do this. Especially, sort of out there with programs that have been around for a long time that maybe have some kind of like political stakes built into them, where there are these ethical issues that are going to put limitations on what you can do and what you can't do. And so, it's really about choosing the best possible design. And here they chose a quasi-experimental design. And I can't really fault them for that, because by randomizing the kids in there, they were able to get rid of a lot of potentially confounding factors, right? Not all of them, but imagine if they just try to do some kind of like time series of looking at kids before and after Head Start. Right, imagine all the stuff that could mess that up. If they tried some other, design. And so, even, less than perfect research is helpful. It does give us an idea, and it's something that we can use to build further research on. We can build further policy on, right? By saying, well, look, I erased it, but let's maintain, the gains that we're getting here, because it's just sad that these kids are doing better academically and emotionally, and then it goes away. So. Any questions? Comments, concerns?
I have an unrelated question.
I'm positive that you do,
Can I ask it?
of course.
Who did your wife cheer for Saturday night?
My wife is a Target.
She went to.
No, she
do-
didn't. We had this conversation.
She didn't go to Duke?
My dad went to it.
Are you serious? I thought the same thing too.
I thought you did too.
No, she wasn't here.
I met my wife in Die Hall.
I don't believe you. I don't believe you.
Google my wife.
Okay. What am I, like if I. Google your name-
Shelley, Shelley. Summerlin-Long. She has way more publications than I do.
Oh, okay.
Online
PA. Okay.
Faculty member at UNC.
No, she went to Duke. Okay.
No, she didn't.
Did any of you remember like?
I remember that.
I feel like I heard.
Damn, she teaches 7. It's like a Mandela effect.
Yeah.
All of it.
Dang.
Strategic
Oh,
700.
I thought her research.
I kind of research
She just got 9
Absolutely.
books.
non-publication.
It does.
I went to like all the websites that you can find your name, like your name, your address, stuff like that. The only place that I found is the voter registry, but even that has my UNC address and not my Charlotte address. But I hate
So you were
it.
able to wipe yourself clean. Like,
I don't think it's completely off there, but my phone number is.
I found some website the other day that I can't remember what it's called now, but it was disturbing. All the connections that they made to me of like my family members and
White pages.
other things. No, it's something else.
Someone.
But it had my phone number on there, had my wife's phone number on there, had my mother-in-law's phone number on there.
That's weird.
Yeah,
Does your phone number end with 5913?
that's a number in my family.
It's really just breaking down like the.
See, this is just disturbing. That is another number in my family.
All of these,
Oh my god.
all of these, and it has your address.
That's so bad.
Oh, I know what she was talking about. Jeez. There's one of those for like. That's not now.
Some of them are.
Yeah, but let's not do that.
Let's not do that.
It might be.
Okay. Any other questions? My wife definitely rooted for the Tar Heels.
Where is your daughter going to college next year?
You missed
So
that.
yeah,
What? You missed that. You
Yeah.
she's committed. She's going here.
Why didn't you wait for me?
I was too excited.
She's gonna come to
She didn't have a
class on
choice.
Tuesday.
No, you don't tear her apart.
No.
No, actually, you wouldn't. She would tear you apart.
Probably.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I ran into AA Ron on Monday.
Did you really?
Yeah, it was a really out of body experience.
I ran into him and we had lunch. Was it last week? Yeah.
No, I've been seeing everyone. Oh, you know who I saw? You know who else I saw on Monday? Rohan.
Did you really?
Yeah.
Oh, I see Rohan.
You know what's funny about having
Rohan's
two
roommate's
two
gonna be
errands
next year.
in class, right? Like I still don't consider it like that popular of a name. But beyond the whole Aaron thing, but I had two errands in my high school class, and there were only 35 of us.
So one of my interviews.
Two of my best friends were named Aaron.
I was like, growing up, I had another Aaron in my class.
You can't
so I
say
was
that.
like, just Aaron. I was
Yeah.
like, Aaron R.
Yeah, and you must hate that Aaron skit. You both must. No. I mean, I think it's one of the funnier skits around.
Yeah.
Okay, anything class related?
No.
Rose, you always look so angry.
Just ask a question.
No, I just want to make sure that you're happy.
I'm sure it's really discussed, but the,
You definitely.
Prom set 3 is, just due sometime in the next couple days. Yeah. I've got too much other stuff to do. I'm not gonna get to look at it anytime in the near future.
Is it the same with the paper, like it's due within a couple of days? So
Yeah.
So in the syllabus, it says like approximately 12 pages for the brief is like 10 to 12, like.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I would say anything from 10 to 14-ish is that's kind of the sweet spot. It largely depends on your topic. I've had 8 papers that are, I've never had one less than 9 pages. But I've had a couple that were 9. I've had some that required 15. You know, but yeah, none of that is like firm. Like I give you those little page ranges because that's typically on like that's the average treatment effect. On average, that's what it takes people to do it well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had an unrelated question though. For next semester, some of my friends wanted to actually take your class, but I think it closed up. I was like, are you having a second section or?
I have an honors section.
Oh, all right.
You know, if you want, you know, tell them to email me and say that you're your friend, and I'll tell them no. No, you know, this is the time of semester. Just so I mean, everyone should know this as a student. Emailing a professor at this point in time to try to get into their class is completely pointless.
Why did advising tell me to do that?
There's nothing that we can do.
Made me look like an idiot in front of my capstone PP professor, because the advising was like, we won't do anything until you email your professor.
And I was like, I know they're not gonna do anything.
Here's
I
the
know they
back end
can't.
personalizer.
Well, so here's the way it works. This is a good thing to understand, I guess, not if you're, about to
I have mine,
graduate or
but it's
something,
like
but
like HCA would sell.
the actual professor has no authority to let you, like, they have the authority to waive certain prereqs and that, like, so that's different. But like to get into 210, I can't do anything about it until the semester starts and the registrar clears the wait list. At that point, if there's literally like physical space in the room, then I can let people in.
I thought you meant to like talk to the public policy
Yeah.
chair coordinator, because I tried to do that for a policy class last semester, and she's like, email this lady, and then she was on vacation, and nobody was answering their emails.
It's
So,
up to, it's,
really good.
I'm not gonna rat out anyone.
I was surprised when,
It's up to the professor.
I was surprised when this section opened up, because I tried to get into the original, like the first section.
That's why this section opened up.
Yeah, I was like, thank God.
But yeah, in the fall, they actually can just change the smaller section to an honors, and I think the other section will be like 150.
Oh,
It's an 8 AM.
where are you teaching with?
It is, I think, 8 AM.
Where's the classroom gonna be?
It's in Gino. My friend said.
Oh,
Gino 200.
Gino's
8 AM, y'all know more about my schedule, right?
So I
I mean, Anastasia knows more about my family.
Anastasia can find out a lot more about
No.
Anastasia doesn't have
Let's not
any-
make that your like random project for the evening or anything.
Anastasia should not blackmail Professor Rodgers.
But,
fun fact is Joe's address.
Writing somebody's address is really easy,
Yeah.
if they own a house.
What about your previous address?
What about voting?
Voting.
Did
I wanna
you
see
live in
local
Washington?
election.
Yeah,
You can also
NCSC.
look, people up to see if they're registered as a Democrat or Republican. You can
Yes,
see
I know.
if they voted in the last couple of elections.
Let's find every vote.
But yeah, you can look and see every election that I voted in.
for student body president.
And I'm
school.
Yes.
To save you from the time and the effort, I'm a registered independent.
Well, yeah, that's a nice thing about NC.
Nice.
You can vote in the primary without having to be registered.
How is that different than unaffiliated? Or is it not?
That's the same thing, I'm pretty sure, right?
I thought if you register independent, you're registering for the independent party. But I may be wrong. And I thought registering.
Voters not.
Okay.
No, she can't leave.
I'm leaving.
Alright, so does that mean like our, the problem set